In the 14th century, 1 in 3 Europeans would die, not from war, plague, or famine, but from winter. These were the seasons that would end careers and lives. Listen closely, and you might hear the chill creep into your own bones. Then, as now, winter came every year, yet each had its own severity. Some were mild, some long, others relentlessly cruel. One thing they shared, though, was silence. For this was before weather stations and reports, even before clocks. People felt the weather as much as saw it. They sensed its approach in the sky's graying light. The drying winds, the falling leaves, the animals' strange behavior. They knew a harsh winter was coming by the way their bodies ached. Before the first flakes fell, when the snow came, though, it was spectacular. Modern snowplows clear streets and sidewalks in hours. In the Middle Ages, people cleared the same paths by hand. At times, the only sound was the squeak of their shoes on the frozen ground. A blanket of silence covered the land. It was a new world. All sound muffled, all colors dulled. Even faces seemed alien behind heavy woolen coverings. Houses looked alien, too cocooned off from the world, with thick walls of packed snow, roofs heavily laden with the white stuff. Villages resembled fortresses, silent and self-contained. Inside these forts, however, life continued much as before. Fires burned, pots hung over those fires, food cooked and warmed hands. Families gathered close. They ate stew seasoned with whatever they could find: roots, berries, cabbage, cheese, occasionally meat. Meals were bland compared to our own, but at least they were plentiful. Those who farmed stored food carefully and prayed for enough. But there was a rhythm to medieval winter. There was work to be done and days to fill. Men worked during the day, women at night. That way, everyone could keep warm while someone kept watch. Children helped by tending poultry, gathering fuel, cleaning out stable and latrine. Entertainment included storytelling, singing, drinking, dice games, backgammon, and chess. Though books were rare, educated men and women read aloud from religious texts or sang scripture. In taverns, they told stories, drank ale, and recited poetry. They also performed plays, some religious, some Bodhi. Not everyone celebrated. Of course, the church held solemn services. The sick went to bed early. Farmers worried about what spring would bring. Lovers stole moments together, aware that death could snatch their loved ones away at any time. Everyone waited for the return of warmer days, for the triumph of light over dark, for life to burst from the frozen earth once more. That is what people did to endure. But how did they survive? The word winter conjures up images of frosty window panes, bare branches, and silent, untracked snows. It conjures up tales of villagers huddling around fires, eating humble fare, and keeping watch against the elements and predators. But how accurate is that picture? In truth, most European villages were prepared for winter. They stocked their pantries full of dried goods. They set aside root vegetables that store well, salted and smoked meats, cheeses, fruits, nuts, honey, and beer. In towns, merchants sold imported spices, wine, and exotic foods to supplement local stores. They even brewed special warming beers. Peasants usually ate plain fare, but wealthier folk could indulge in delicacies like spiced goose or peacock. After all, feasts were an important part of medieval life. Imagine sitting around a long table laden with food after a long day of working in the cold. What would you eat? Start with a simple supper. Most families ate something hearty to warm their insides. Maybe a thick soup with chunks of bread. A stew made from whatever vegetables were available. Nuts and fruit compote to sweeten the day's end. Next, a protein dish. Perhaps a ham or a turkey with roasted vegetables or a venison roast flavored with herbs. Finally, a rich dessert, like a baked apple with honey or a sweetened almond cake. Finish it off with fresh pomegranate juice. And it's easy to see why so many medieval paintings depict people eating with such gusto. But a meal is only one part of surviving winter. Equally important is staying warm. To do that, the villagers donned multiple layers of thick wool clothing. They wore sturdy leather boots, Hooded cloaks, warm gowns, woolen stockings, knitted caps, gloves. Sometimes they used furs. Over time, they learned to make the most of natural materials and what little technology they had. Remember that every piece of clothing was handmade, woven, stitched, dyed by hand. Natural materials had their pros and cons. Wool was warm, water resistant, quick drying, but it smelled when it got dirty. Leather was tough, flexible, but not as insulating as wool. Linen was cool and comfortable, but took forever to dry. Cotton was soft and absorbent, but tore easily still. These limitations spurred innovation. Tailors developed clever ways to layer fabrics, making the most of each material's strengths while hiding its weaknesses. The result was complex garments with dozens of overlapping panels, allowing multiple layers without the bulk. Finally, there were the houses. Most were built of stone or wood, with thick walls and small windows designed to keep out drafts. Roofs were steep and strong, needed to hold up to heavy winter snows. Hearths were large and chimneys tall, to draw air and heat upwards. Some homes even had wall-sized cupboards to keep food and drink cool. Despite these precautions, winters were still dangerous. Snow could reach waist or chest height. Blizzards swept across mountain passes and coastal plains, froze solid and buried travelers under tons of snow. The northern lights flickered eerily, and if that was not enough, there was always the risk of fire. For every precaution against cold carried its opposite risk. A hearth to warm you could burn down your home. And when it came to heating, there was no such thing as a thermostat. It was trial and error. A skilled homemaker could coax embers into flames and tend the fire to keep it going through the worst of the winter storms. But she might wake in the black of night to a dying fire, forcing her to rouse the household to stoke it back to life. Each morning brought the same concerns. Would the sun rise? Would the ice crack? Would the crops survive? Each night brought the same routines. Each evening people shut and bolted doors, barred windows, drew curtains and blinds, lit fires, checked the roof, closed their chickens in for the night, put animals out of reach of wolves, tucked children in warmly, said their prayers and tried to sleep. For villagers, the cycle never ended. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. Winter lasted for months, and so did the routine. It was relentless and exhausting. Still, life went on. They played games, tended animals, mended clothes, fixed tools, sang and danced, dreamed of spring. Winter was more than a season. It was a challenge, a battle against nature that tested people's mettle. It demanded respect, preparation, vigilance. It tried their skill and luck. For people in medieval Europe, winter did not just happen to them. They lived through it, day by day, sunrise to sunset, ember to ember, meal to meal, hoping for the best, bracing for the worst, and trying to keep going until spring returned. As a kid, I spent countless hours playing video games based in medieval settings, slaying dragons and saving princesses. Yet I never understood what it must have been like for the real villagers living in those times, trudging through knee-deep snow, eating watery soup, tending fires through the endless nights. Thanks for joining me on this journey through history. I hope you learned something new and maybe gained a fresh perspective on a familiar topic. If you enjoyed this video, show your support. I'll see you next time. It's difficult to know where this story started. Maybe at the edges, like the flapping of a raven's wings against the wind or the low moan of the first fallen leaves scraping down the chimney. Or maybe it began in the garden, with a sudden urgency of digging up potatoes or gathering the last ripe apples before they hardened into sour cider. It's impossible to say. In some ways, winter stories have no beginning, no middle, no end. They just are. You would know it if you lived one. If your hands had shriveled and hardened like walnuts. If you could see how light fell differently through windows after sunset. But if you've only heard them told, these tales of snow and storms and howling nights, they all sound the same until they become the one that you live. The first stage is always denial. You tell yourself the cold is nothing more than a chill. It will pass. And indeed, at first, it is mild, manageable. The days grow short and sweet, like gingerbread men. Pumpkins grin from windowsills. Smoke curls from chimneys. Children shout games from frozen streets. The sun lingers, painting rosy cheeks and frost-kissed window panes. Later, the trees begin to whisper of change. Leaves turn the color of drying blood and fall in slow motion. The ponds grow hard and shiny, reflecting the grayness of an impending sky. But you still don't worry. After all, it's only November. There is plenty of time. You wear the tunic from October, adding a cloak that has more holes than fabric. Your fingers are nimble enough to pull on gloves, though the leather feels stiff and unkind. You hurry inside before the damp seeps through your bones. There is tea and toast and warm bread baking in the oven. The worries can wait until tomorrow. Perhaps by then the world will have mended itself. The next stage is anger, that lasts as long as the third week in December. By now, the meadows are buried in mud. Water runs sluggish and dark. Overhead, the sky is always gray, even when the sun shines. Fires are lit early. In the evenings, shadows stretch and flicker across the walls. Everyone speaks in hushed voices. Every creak of the house sounds like a footstep outside. Each gust of wind is someone knocking to be let in. Doors are kept closed. Windows are nailed shut. There is no joy in the flickering flames, only the knowledge that something, anything, might burn away the darkness. Sometimes it does. On particularly bitter nights, you wake in the night to find every eye watching the fire, each face illuminated by its dancing light. The flames devour wood and hope, and you wonder what might happen if they spread. And still, there are chores. The chickens need feeding. Pigs must be shut in for the night. The cattle need their blankets. Bedding is changed daily. The water must be brought in. The fire tended. Food prepared. Each task is a battle. Hands chapped and bleeding. Fingers clumsy with cold. Nerves thick and leaden. You move through the days like a somnambulist, half asleep, half alive. You dream of green fields and flowing water, and waking to a sky that weeps. The third stage is bargaining. This is the longest. It stretches from New Year's Day to the shortest day. The days are barely distinguishable. One grayness bleeds into the next. The wind grows colder, shriller. Snow falls steadily, relentlessly. It piles up against the door. It deadens the sound of footsteps, muffles voices. No one goes out unless they must. The snowdrifts grow higher and higher, swirling around the corners of buildings, crawling up window panes. Now, dreams are full of running, trying to outrun the cold, seeking shelter, finding none. Each morning you wake with the certainty that this time will be different. This time the fire will stay warm throughout the night. This time the provisions will last. This time the sun will shine. You dress carefully in layers, tucking scraps of cloth into every crevice. You set off for the market, your basket swinging, empty, empty. You bring home turnips and barley and salted fish. You mend a shutter, patch a quilt, trim a wick. You think, if only I had done this sooner. If only I had listened to the whispers of winter in the summer, when the branches were heavy with plums, when the fields whispered of a coming famine, when the old woman warned of storms, when the raven croaked, when the cat curled up and died. If only. You can't remember what you ate yesterday, but today you eat slowly, savoring every mouthful, counting calories, rationing sweets, lighting candles, only 2 hours before sunset. No more. You sit close to the fire, letting its heat soak into you, huddling with your children, reading stories, making believe that nothing is cold or empty or afraid. You tell yourself the king is coming, the goose is fat, but in the attic, the rats gnaw hungrily in the rafters. Then the storm arrives. Some winters, it comes suddenly, crashing and booming, fierce and brief. Other years, it creeps insidiously, coldly blanketing the world, muffling all sound. It stays for weeks, sometimes months. You wake before dawn and wonder where you are. What do you remember? The smell of smoke, the taste of porridge, the feel of straw under your back. Nothing is yours. Everything is shared. Animals huddle in sheds. People huddle by the fire. Eyes are dull, cheeks hollow. Laughter is rare. After the storm is the long waiting. It can last a long time, long enough for hair to grow, and fingernails to break and hopes to dwindle. Winter seems eternal, unchanging. The fire burns low and long. Outside, the wind rises and falls, rises and falls. Each day is shorter than the last. The sun, a distant memory. The moon and stars are cold comfort. Everyone waits for spring, but spring may never come. This is the 6th month of winter. The fuel is almost spent. There are few embers left. And when the kettle is put on, the steam makes a thin ghost in the air. Soon, even the shadows will go out. Soon, there will be no more shadows. But as long as there is a fire, as long as there is someone to watch it, as long as there is anyone to listen, stories will be told. Stories of summers past, of winter's future, of heroes bold and monsters slain, of love and loss, of lives well lived and lives left behind. Stories spun from memories and dreams, and the courage it takes to keep going when all you want to do is sleep. Stories that say, even if the world is cold and dark and empty, if the road ahead looks endless and hard and white, if the hands that hold you are shaking and the breath in your chest is shallow and thin, if the fire has burned low and the oil lamp flickers and dies, even then there is magic left. You only have to listen for it. You only have to look for it. You only have to reach out and touch it. I wrote this piece about a year ago, and it's my most popular piece of flash fiction ever. People seemed to like it, so I decided to turn it into an audiobook. It seems a lot of people liked the audio version too. When I first wrote this piece, I wanted to capture what it must be like to live through a harsh winter. You know, in the age before central heating, insulation, refrigeration, and modern clothing, when a harsh winter could mean the difference between life and death. I also wanted to write a story that captured a kind of bleakness and despair, a sense of fate. Most of us are blessed to live in times where we don't have to worry about such things. So when I wrote this piece, I thought, hey, why not get some feedback from someone who has actually lived through such harsh conditions? So I shared the piece with my wife's grandmother, who was born in Siberia and spent her childhood there during World War II. She read the piece and told me that she liked it very much, but it needs more snow. So I added in a little bit more snow, and then she said it was perfect. Okay, so I've got a question for you. Imagine you're living in a world without central heating, insulation, or modern clothing. You survived the fall, and you've managed to prepare well for the coming winter. Your home is sturdy. You have food, water, and fuel. Your animals are housed and fed. But now the winter has come, and it's going to be a harsh one. All of the worst fears you had about winter have come true. The temperatures plummet, the winds blow, the snow piles up. And now you look out at the snow-covered landscape and realize that you are trapped. There will be no escape from this winter. You are locked in now. The earth has closed for business until spring. You can't go anywhere. You're stuck here. So the question is, how do you pass the time? What do you do? What do you think about? What keeps you sane? Let me know in the comments section below. Outside, the ground turned to iron. What had been mud last week froze into ruts that twisted ankles and swallowed boots. Water in the bucket froze overnight, forcing you to break the ice each morning with a ladle, cursing softly as your hands went numb. And above, the sky hung low and gray, like a lid sealing you in. The clouds gave no messages, only silence, only the promise that you would not see the sun again for weeks. In town, voices grew shorter, jokes disappeared. Even sermons in the church turned darker. The priest declared that the cold was God's way of teaching humility. You wondered quietly whether God might try a kinder lesson plan. And then one morning, the snow came. Not a blizzard, not yet just a scattering, like pale flowers across the fields. But it changed everything. Thatch turned white, trees stiffened, and every step outside crunched like brittle parchment. With that snow came the realization. You were locked in now. The earth had closed for business until spring. Nothing more would grow. Whatever you had stored was all you had. And if it was not enough, then you would discover how thin a stew could become. The first thing that stood out to me when reading this was just how vividly the author paints the setting. He really brings you into his world and makes you feel the cold. The author doesn't tell you that it's cold. He shows you that it's cold. For example, instead of saying the ground was frozen, he says the ground turned to iron, and that's a much more vivid and interesting way to describe it. When I read this piece, I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. It was like being there. Also, the author does a great job of building suspense. As the story progresses, the weather gets worse and worse. And as the temperature drops, so does the mood. The author makes you feel like you're trapped, hopeless and helpless. He makes you feel like there's nothing you can do to change what's happening. You begin to measure life, not in days, but in bundles. How many bundles of firewood were left? How many sacks of grain? How many turnips? How many eggs this week? The hens slowed down in the cold. They preferred to sit close to the fire, much like everyone else. You filled the hours with small tasks, even when they felt pointless. Mending torn clothes, scraping blackened pans, stirring ashes, hoping for a hidden ember, spinning wool when time allowed, not only for cloth, but to keep hands moving and minds occupied. Too much silence, and thoughts grew dangerous. Now, I mentioned earlier that the author does a great job of building suspense. Well, the ending is another example of that. As the story comes to a close, you can feel the hopelessness and helplessness growing. The author makes you feel like there's nothing you can do but wait and see what happens next. In the end, you're left feeling desperate and alone. The last sentence, "Too much silence, and thoughts grew dangerous," is one of the most powerful sentences I've ever read. It just really hammers home the feeling of desperation and hopelessness. I love it. The language used throughout this piece is incredibly rich and evocative. The author uses a lot of sensory details to really bring you into his world. You can hear the crunch of the snow underfoot, feel the icy water on your hands, smell the smoke from the fire. It's incredibly immersive. Overall, I think this is a fantastic piece of writing. It's well written, engaging, and thought-provoking. I highly recommend it. Okay, so let's talk about the narrator now. Who is this story being told from? The story is being told from a first-person point of view. We only know the thoughts and feelings of the main character, and this works perfectly for the story. We need to be inside the character's head to fully understand their fear and despair. If the story was being told from any other point of view, it wouldn't be nearly as effective. The first-person point of view helps us to connect with the character and feel their emotions. We need to be inside the character's head to fully understand their fear and despair. If the story was being told from any other point of view, it wouldn't be nearly as effective. Let's talk about the tone of this piece. What is it? The tone of this piece is bleak and hopeless. There's no mistaking that. The author paints a picture of a world that is harsh and unforgiving. The story takes place in a small town, and the people are struggling to survive. They're cold, hungry, and afraid. They don't know if they'll make it through the winter. This creates a sense of tension and suspense. We're on the edge of our seats the whole time, waiting to see if they'll make it. But unfortunately, we know it's not going to happen. By the end of the story, we can feel the hopelessness growing. It's clear that these people are trapped and there's nothing they can do to change that. Now, the style of this piece is poetic. The author uses beautiful language and imagery to create a vivid picture in our minds. He writes, "Outside, the ground turned to iron. What had been mud last week froze into ruts that twisted ankles and swallowed boots." This is a stunning image. We can hear the crunch of the snow underfoot, feel the icy water on our hands, smell the smoke from the fire. It's incredibly immersive. Okay, so what is the meaning of this piece? What is the author trying to say? Well, I think this piece is about hope, or rather, the lack of hope. The people in this story have lost hope. They don't think things will get better. They don't believe that they can make it through the winter. And as a result, they're trapped in a cycle of despair. But I think the author is trying to tell us that we should never lose hope. No matter how difficult things may seem, there is always hope for better days ahead. This is a bleak and hopeless story, but it's also a beautiful and haunting one. The writing is stunning and the characters are unforgettable. I highly recommend it. It was the worst time of year, the period between Christmas and Easter, when the sun was a miser, hoarding its meager light and warmth. The nights were long, the wind was sharp, and even the animals huddled indoors sought relief from the biting cold. They were more than livestock. They were fellow survivors. Each had its own mournful cry, its own story of loss, its own dream of spring. The warmest were invited inside, not all at once, but enough to make the house a stew of smells, sounds, and body heat. You might wake up with a goat breathing at your neck, smelling of wet wool and hay, and a lamb nuzzling your hand, seeking warmth. It was not something you got used to, nor did you stop fearing it, even in the darkest depths of winter. When the earth was buried under a thick blanket of snow and the sky seemed to weep an endless torrent of gray sleet, you found yourself yearning for the first breath of spring, the croaking of frogs, the buzzing of flies. Anything to break the suffocating quiet that pressed against your eardrums like a shroud. Evenings were the hardest. The sun fled too soon, and the dark came like a thief, angry and heavy, clutching at your heart as it settled in your bones. Candles were costly, and the thick tallow lamps filled the hut with smoke and the stench of burning animal fat. So you sat by the fire, if there was one, and listened to the crack of wood, the howl of wind, the creak of the old house. The stories passed from mouth to mouth, tales of bravery, love, loss, and legends of creatures that stalked the night. Sometimes, someone began a ghost story. It always seemed clever until you had to cross the freezing yard to the privy afterward, praying not to trip, not to see what might be watching in the shadows. And yet, winter was not pure misery. There was rhythm, a bitter predictability. The chores were known, the limits clear. There was a strange comfort in knowing that everyone else was just as miserable. Small victories mattered. Warm feet for a few minutes, a stew that didn't taste entirely like despair, a day without wind slicing through the walls, a night without the roof leaking onto your face. You celebrated quietly, because loud joy would only bring reminders. This was just the beginning. Winter was not conquered, merely endured. It killed not only with cold, but with chores. At the top of the frozen to-do list, firewood. You didn't need a few logs for charm. You needed firewood the way you needed breath. Because without it, you were not a peasant. You were a frozen corpse with taxes. But firewood didn't appear by magic. It had to be cut, hauled, chopped, stacked, cursed. It was another full-time job, one that paid only in blisters and frostbite. The axe was cracked, the blade blunt, but still better than bare hands, which, inevitably, you used anyway, once the axe stuck in a log or slipped off a branch, leaving another jagged gash in your already ruined gloves. You worked until your muscles screamed and your eyes burned with unshed tears. It wasn't enough. No amount of wood was enough. You were surrounded by forests, yet each tree was a battle, each log a victory. And the victories were never yours. They belonged to the wood, the stubborn giants, standing defiant, enduring your pathetic blows. They mocked you with their silent strength. They watched you pant and freeze and bleed. They marked your territory with your blood. The wood was patient. You were not. As the days dragged on, so did the list of chores. The animals still needed tending. Someone had to watch over them, milk the goats, feed the chickens, clean the coops, lead the horse to water, groom the pigs. For what? For rich fodder that tasted like sawdust and ice. Who would harvest what they sowed? Who would tend the fields come spring? Only those who survived the winter were considered for these tasks. But the odds weren't good. Starvation was a constant guess. A gaunt, gray-haired man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. He sat at the corner table, never eating, always watching. His gaze was unsettling, not because he spoke little, but because when he did, his voice sounded like the scraping of a plow across frozen earth. Sickness was another uninvited guest. She walked softly, silently, wrapping her icy fingers around your throat, stealing your breath, stealing your breath, stealing your will to live. When she struck, there was no defense, no cure, only fear and the slow, agonizing wait for death to come. If the guest didn't kill you, the solitude would. It pressed against you, heavy, suffocating, whispering doubts, amplifying fears. It made each shadow seem like a lurking beast, every creak a harbinger of doom. And then there was the silence, deafening, unbroken. Save for the wind's mournful song, the silence became a character in itself. It seeped into your bones, chilled your heart, stole your words. It was a heavy cloak, a suffocating blanket. It whispered, screamed, echoed your unspoken thoughts. It was a constant reminder of your isolation, a stark counterpoint to the bustling life that raged outside the frozen window pane. You longed to break it, to shatter the stillness, but what could you say? What could you do? In the face of such crushing quiet, you felt utterly powerless. There were moments, though, brief moments, when the oppressive weight of winter seemed to lift just enough for hope to flicker. A shared smile over a meager meal, a helping hand, an unspoken understanding and a look. These were the lifelines you clung to, the anchors that kept you tethered to humanity in the face of winter's dehumanizing grip. But such moments were rare, precious, fragile things, like snowflakes melting on your tongue. You learned to read the signs, the subtle shifts in the wind, the patterns of cloud formations, the whispers of birds, anything that hinted at the sun's return. The sun, that distant memory, a golden orb of warmth and light. You dreamed of its touch, its caress on your skin, the gentle heat seeping into your bones. You ached for its embrace, its laughter echoing in your ears, the promise of a new day dawning in your heart. Yet you knew that spring was a fickle mistress. She could tease and torment, keeping winter's icy hand on your shoulder just a little longer, taunting you with the scent of blooming flowers, the chirp of returning birds, the whisper of leaves unfurling. She could linger at the edge of the forest, painting the trees in hues of green, yet keep her warmth locked away, hidden behind a veil of frosty clouds. She could smile at you from the sky, a sliver of sunlight breaking through the gloom. The sky turned from blue to gray to black. Days grew short, nights grew cold. You gathered fruit and nuts, salted and dried meat for winter stores. Then you turned to chopping wood. You were told to start early, in autumn, but harvest ran late. Neighbors borrowed tools, accidents happened, and so, more often than not, you found yourself in December, swinging steel at trees like enemies, praying they fell the right way. And when they did, the work was far from over. Chopping, hauling, stacking, over and over, 50 times or more. Even then, wood was never enough. By February, you burned fence posts, furniture, anything that would catch flame. Sentiment had no place here. If it burned, it was fuel. Arguments even broke out over who wasted the good stick too soon. You hoarded embers like treasure, dreamed of dry logs, and brought home a branch like a war trophy. The wealthy sent servants to fetch wood. You were the servant, and often the forest belonged to lords. Gathering sticks on noble land could earn you fines, beatings, or worse. So peasants turned to peat, dried dung, or brushwood. These burned poorly, smelled worse. But survival was not about pride. At night, sitting by the fire, tired, sore, and lightly smoked, you felt something close to peace. Not comfort, but the absence of doom. And in the Middle Ages, that was the closest thing to safety. If you are enjoying this video and want to see more, please subscribe. It really helps me. When winter set in, it brought with it hunger, and not the gentle ache of a skipped meal, but a sharp emptiness that gnawed at your ribs and whispered in your ear. You did not plan meals. You rationed them. You stretched what you had, convincing yourself that 3 shriveled turnips were a feast. Each bite of each meager meal was a victory against hunger, a tribute to the grim determination that kept you alive. Winter was not just a season, it was a test. It sifted out the weak, leaving only the resolute and the resourceful. But even the most rugged spirit had its limits. As the weeks wore on, your body began to bear the brunt of the conflict between your dwindling stores and your insatiable need for sustenance. Every bone ached, every muscle screamed in protest at the constant struggle against the gnawing void within. The hands that once chopped wood or toiled in the fields now trembled, not from old age, but from privation. The eyes that once looked to the horizon with hope now stared blankly ahead, dulled by hunger's relentless assault. Yet you pressed on, driven by an instinct older than thought, a will to live that defied the icy grip of winter's embrace. In those long, dark months, your evenings became a ritual of denial, a defiance of the cold. As twilight painted the sky in hues of fading light, you retreated indoors, seeking solace in the flickering glow of your hearth. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful dirge that spoke of frozen landscapes and barren trees. But within your rough-hewn walls, you held your ground. With each gust that rattled the windows, you fed the fire, coaxing it to life with whispers of defiance. For in that tiny flame, you saw a reflection of your own spirit, unwavering, unbowed, refusing to succumb to the encroaching darkness. Your world shrunk to the size of your hut, your concerns to the dwindling pile of fuel outside. The storm raged on, but within your shelter, you found a measure of peace, a quiet strength that whispered, "I may not be able to outrun the blizzard, but I won't freeze. I'll burn first." And so you endured, clinging to life with the tenacity of a weed pushing through a crack in the pavement. You are a testament to the human spirit's resilience, a flicker of hope in a frozen wasteland. Your existence itself became a victory, every sunrise a triumph over the specter of death that stalked your every waking moment. You were a warrior in a battle against the elements, and though the odds were stacked against you, you fought on, sustained by the stubborn refusal to surrender. Winter's chills seeped into your bones, sapped your energy, sharpened your senses. You moved slowly, conserving effort, watching every movement, guarding against waste. In the vastness of the frozen landscape, you found solace in the mundane, the delicate dance of a sparrow on a window ledge, the patient gaze of a cat seeking warmth. The sun's arc across the sky became your clock, marking the relentless passage of time that seemed both endless and fleeting. With each turn, you readjusted, conserving every ounce of strength, shrinking further into yourself until you were a solitary ember in a vast frozen expanse. Days blurred into weeks, each indistinguishable from the last. The world outside your window transformed into a monochrome canvas, stark and silent. Trees stood sentinel, their branches gnarled fingers pointing accusingly towards the sullen sky. Fields lay dormant, buried under a thick white shroud, muffling all sound. The wind's mournful song echoed across the frozen expanse, a constant reminder of the biting cold that threatened to consume you whole. And yet within your shelter, you held fast. You were a lone candle flame in the gathering darkness, flickering defiantly against the encroaching shadows. Your world contracted, becoming smaller, quieter, more intimate. The very air within your home bore witness to your struggle, each breath a testament to the primal urge to survive. You became attuned to the subtlest of sounds, the creak of timbers, the whisper of drafts, the rustle of fabric as you shifted. Silence took on a new weight, amplifying the rhythm of your existence. Heartbeat, breath, the measured pulse of life. The outside world faded away, becoming a distant memory, a half-remembered dream. You were cocooned off, insulated from everything except the immediacy of your plight. Time lost its linear march. It contracted, collapsing the vast expanse of days into a single, unending now. Past, present, and future converged, leaving only the stark reality of this moment, of this struggle for mere existence. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, cold fingers of light, you retreated further into the sanctuary of your home. There you waited, not passively, but with the fierce expectancy of a hunter, alert, tense, ready to spring into action at the first sign of opportunity. Hope flickered, fragile as a newborn star, fragile as the first fragile green shoots pushing through the frozen earth. It was a promise of renewal, a whisper of warmth amidst the icy grip of winter's domain. You clung to it, nurtured it, allowing it to bloom into a tenacious flame that refused to be extinguished. For in this frozen crucible, hope was the only fuel that could keep you warm. Spring's hesitant touch was like a secret shared between the earth and the sky. It came not in a burst of color and warmth, but in subtle whispers, a trickling of melting snow, the hesitant chirp of a returning bird. The sun climbed higher, casting tentative rays that hinted at the summer's bounty. But winter's grip still held, tenacious and unforgiving. Yet this was no longer a season. It was a challenge, one that demanded not just endurance, but ingenuity. You scoured every nook and cranny of your surroundings, seeking out the first tender shoots, the earliest signs of life stirring beneath the thawing earth. Each leaf, each shoot, each tiny bulb was a victory, a testament to nature's indomitable spirit, a reassurance that life, like spring, always returned. With these fragile tokens of renewal in your grasp, you felt a surge of determination, a sudden clarity of purpose. No longer would you be a passive victim of winter's fury. You were a gatherer, a scavenger, an accumulator of hope. You gathered sticks, dried leaves, whatever you could find to stoke your fires, each piece fueling not just your hearth, but your spirit. Winter might have been the season of scarcity, but spring was the season of anticipation, the calm before the storm. And you prepared not just for the coming warmth, but for the inevitable return of hunger. You bartered, traded, scavenged, doing whatever it took to secure the seeds of life. The promise of nourishment comes summer's bountiful embrace. In the heart of this frozen wilderness, where trees stood like skeletal sentinels and the wind carried the scent of icy solitude, you discovered the true meaning of resilience. You were a solitary figure, etched against the stark backdrop of winter's domain. Yet you were not alone, for within you burned the unyielding spirit of humanity, the tenacious will to not just survive, but to persevere, to hope, to prepare, and ultimately to thrive. Thank you for watching. See you next time. I found this article titled, "What Would a Medieval Peasant Have Eaten in a Year?" and thought, well, yeah, what would they have eaten? But what about everything else? What did they touch? What did they smell? So here is a tour of the medieval peasant's house. Welcome to the series Living as an 18th century Scottish Highlander. Meat was a rare treasure. If you slaughtered a pig or goat in autumn, you salted, smoked, or dried every piece, hiding it away from greedy children. Fish could be caught if rivers weren't frozen. But ice fishing was misery a whole, hacked through ice, numb toes, and endless waiting. Bread was essential, but dangerous, hard, heavy, sometimes mixed with bark or ground acorns. Worse still, rye bread often carried a hidden killer-rugot fungus, causing visions, spasms, or death. You didn't know the science. You just knew the bread sometimes made neighbors see angels or demons. You took eggs from chickens only when absolutely necessary. Chickens were too busy surviving to lay, and fresh fruits and greens were only a memory. Perhaps a dried plum from last summer, if it hadn't rotted. Vitamin C came from sour cabbage or fermented turnip, crunchy disappointment. In vinegar, nothing was wasted. Bones boiled twice, fat saved, ashes scrubbed into soap, and still, hunger remained. You went to bed hungry, woke up hungrier, and lived with it until spring. Some winters were worse famines that struck whole regions. Crops drowned, livestock starved, people disappeared. Records spoke of families clutching turnips as if they were treasure, of neighbors vanishing into snowdrifts, of whispers of cannibalism. Hunger was not just survival, it was humiliation. Your home was not a refuge. It was more suggestion than shelter. A wooden frame, mud, straw, and prayer, held together by habit and desperation. Walls were woven, strips plastered with clay, dung, and gossip. On good days, wind whistled through the cracks. On bad days, it howled like a landlord demanding rent. The roof was thatched a blanket of dried plants that leaked, sagged, and hosted birds, mice, and insects. Sometimes, it collapsed mid-storm, dropping ceiling and chickens into your lap. The floor was dirt mud when wet, dust when dry, ice when frozen. Straw laid down for comfort turned quickly into rotting, moldy mats that smelled of feet and despair. Windows, only holes, maybe covered with parchment if you were lucky. Doors rarely latched. Hinges moaned like wounded animals. Fire pits smoked endlessly. Chimneys were rare, so the air inside filled with gray fog. You stopped noticing the smell of smoke because you were smoke. Furniture was scarce. A bench, a stool, a rough table. Beds with sacks of straw shared with spouse, children, and sometimes animals. Blankets of wool or furs if something nearby had died recently. Nights were spent in layers of clothing, Praying body heat plus stubbornness equaled survival. Privacy did not exist. Thin walls meant you heard every cough, every argument, every snore. The cottage was shared not only with family, but with goats, pigs, chickens, livestock doubling as radiators. It was crowded, noisy, filthy, but slightly less cold. Maintenance was constant, cracks patched with moss, leaks caught with buckets. You named the drips in the roof, cursed them, and shifted your bed to avoid them. And still, you called it home. Not because it was comfortable, but because it was the only thing standing between you and the grave. First impressions: pitch black, cramped, smoky, stinky. But then you got used to it. You became the darkness. You adapted to the sounds. You learned to love the smells. Still, your nose worked overtime trying to keep track of it all. Roasted meat over the fire. That was heaven. Then roasted goat. Then burnt porridge. Then dirty socks. The list went on. In the morning, a thin layer of ash covered everything. It stuck to your skin and tasted faintly of regret. When someone visited, they brought new smells. A peddler reeking of stale sweat and pipe tobacco. A priest smelling faintly of incense and fear. A lord whose fine clothes hid the reek of horses and old money. Toilets, luxury. The nearest tree was your porcelain throne. Then there was the small matter of sharing your living space with insects. They crawled, flew, bit, and dropped from the ceiling. Spiders spun webs across your doorway. Fleas jumped from cat to person to dog. Ticks crawled into your hair and drank your blood. Then there were the mice. They scurried around your feet, nesting in your clothes, fighting each other in the grain stores. The cats kept things under control most of the time, but sometimes a mouse would dart across the room and dive into your porridge. Oh, the rats. They grew fat on stolen scraps, clambering up your walls, slinking into your bed, watching you sleep with malevolent little eyes. Occasionally, a stray dog would wander in, sniffing hopefully at your meager stores. Dogs had their own hierarchy of smells. You smelled of nothing much. Village folk smelled of hard work and hopelessness. Rich folk smelled of fear and decay. Kings and queens smelled like failure. Animals smelled of their world. Birds smelled of freedom and fish. Deer and wild boars smelled of the forest and death. Wolves smelled of cold and danger. Yes, even a blind beggar wandering through town carried more exotic smells than you did. You tried not to think about it too much. Instead, you focused on the quiet dignity of life in the dark. You felt your way around your home. Sight was overrated anyway. Sounds told you everything you needed to know. The crackle of the fire, the sigh of the wind, the creak of the stairs, the rumble of thunder, the splash of rain, the babble of the brook. Once you learned to listen, the world opened up. Sound became sight. You saw the darkness as alive, pulsing, breathing, moving. You listened for footsteps on the path outside your door. The jingle of a bell, the caw of a crow, the chirp of a cricket. Sounds painted pictures in your mind, stories whispered in the dark. You understood the language of the forest. Rustling leaves meant deer grazing nearby, a snapping twig, a fox or wolf passing by. Hooting owls told you of approaching storms. Buzzing insects foretold hot, sunny days. At night, the wind sang. It moaned in the trees, hummed in the chimney, whispered in your ear. The wind was full of stories, tales of faraway places, legends of brave heroes, warnings of lurking dangers. In the dark, imagination soared. Without light to hold you back, your mind roamed free. In the dark, you dreamed of colors. Patchwork quilts of starlight shone in the blackest skies. Glowing embers danced in the hearth. Moonlight silvered the window pane. Visions burned behind your eyelids. Landscapes swam before your eyes. Angels with fiery wings glided through the shadows. In the dark, you found magic. Herbs glowed under the moonlight. Mushrooms shimmered in the forest. Fireflies blinked secrets in the night. Shooting stars streaked across the heavens. Wishes whispered on falling stars took flight. The dark was alive with wonder. You didn't need light to see. You just needed eyes to believe. and belief, you had plenty of that. This is part of the series, Living as an 18th Century Scottish Highlander. Each episode explores some aspect of daily life in the past. Check out the playlist for more. Thanks for watching. This is a history hot tip. Life in the Middle Ages was hard. Sickness was unavoidable. You woke one day with a cough, a fever, or joints that felt as though they were being twisted from within. There were no doctors as you know them, only remedies, most of which hurt more than they helped. Bleeding was the favorite cure. A dull knife or leeches drained you until you were lightheaded, if not weaker. Herbal teas brewed from nettle, wormwood, or moss tasted like betrayal. Fasting was often prescribed because starving was somehow meant to heal. Smoke, steam, prayer, and occasionally hot coals pressed against skin were other treatments. Help depended on who arrived first. A healer with herbs, a priest with holy water, or a barber surgeon with saws and no soap. None inspired much confidence. Infections spread quickly in cramped, smoky huts filled with livestock. One cough turned into an epidemic within days. Superstition explained everything. Curses, bad air, evil eyes. Herbs were hung in doorways, charms placed under beds, prayers muttered endlessly. Rest was a luxury no one could afford. Firewood still needed chopping, animals still needed feeding, children still needed food. You staggered through snow with fever because survival left no room for weakness. Some recovered, many didn't. Those who survived carried scars, pain, and memories of nights spent sweating through wool, listening for death in every rattle of breath. For some medieval peasants, life might have been bearable, maybe even good. But death, well, that was always around the corner, and sometimes it arrived unannounced. This is a series about the worst parts of life in the past. So today, let's talk about medieval peasant life and what made it so deadly. So where are we going with this? Well, there are a couple directions we can take. We can go to a source that gives us a wide overview of daily life in the Middle Ages. Or we can go to a secondary source that interprets a primary source focusing on economic history. How about we do both? Let's start with the wide-angle lens. The book I'm looking at is called The Medieval World, and it was published by a company called Lucent. They put out a bunch of overview books on world history. I've used several of them in the past. The section I'm reading is called The Labor of Life, and it begins with this lovely observation. The lives of most people during the Middle Ages revolved around work. Now, before we get too far into our little exploration, let me just say that when historians use the term Middle Ages, they don't mean the same thing as the expression medieval times implies. Historians define the Middle Ages as a time period between roughly the 5th and 15th centuries, and even though they're talking about a millennium of time, it's important to remember that not all places were affected equally by these changes. For example, many scholars would argue that Western Europe was still quite backward in comparison to the Islamic world in the 13th century. Anyway, I digress. Back to the text. Medieval peasants worked long hours growing crops, taking care of livestock, making repairs, and preparing for winter. They rarely had enough to eat, and when hunger stalked them, sleep became a luxury they couldn't afford. Lords expected peasants to pay their dues on time, whether or not they had enough food. So what were these dues? Glad you asked. Remember that most medieval peasants were tied to their land and obligated to do work for their lord. In return for that, the lord was supposed to protect them and ensure that they had the resources to survive. However, lords weren't always generous. The constant threat of famine meant that they often took advantage of their position and squeezed their peasants for more. So let's see what they got nicked for. First, there were taxes, rent, and fees. Lords demanded payments in cash, in kind, or in labor. When you paid in cash, you handed over exactly what you owed. But when you paid in kind, you gave the lord a share of your harvest. Sometimes peasants had to make these payments in labor instead. They might be called upon to repair a road, build a castle, or harvest a lord's fields. Not very fun. Second, there were tithes. Every parish church received a tenth of the community's income, produce, or livestock. And finally, there were special assessments. These were extra payments levied to support the Crusades, build a new church, or pay for a lord's lavish wedding. It's easy to see then why the author of this passage opens with the statement that most people's lives revolved around work. Okay, so that gives us a general idea of what life was like. But what if we want to dig deeper? Well, luckily for us, there are plenty of primary sources that tell us about these payments. To read a primary source is to look at something produced in the time period you're interested in. A diary, a building, a painting, anything that tells us about the past. The passage we read earlier is a secondary source because it was written after the Middle Ages and interprets a primary source. To better understand this system, we'll be using excerpts from two accounts. First is a list of payments collected by a royal official named Adam de Sully in 1284 in northern France. The second is an account from the English village of Acton-Bernau in the early 13th century. Both examples give us insights into the role of money in medieval life. In the excerpt from Adam de Sully's accounts, we can see how much his community was taxed. The total amount he owed was 379 livres. Let's convert that to a modern currency. According to a conversion tool, 1 livre is worth approximately 15 euros. So 379 livres is equal to 5,685 euros. Now, let's convert that to US dollars. 5,685 euros is equal to $6,214. That means that the average person in Adam's community paid around $6,214 in taxes. The interesting thing here is that most people in this time period were poor and did not carry around sacks of gold. Instead, they paid their taxes in labor or in kind. Let's see what life looked like for the English villagers in Acton-Bernau. According to the records, a man named Robert D. Acton had a variety of financial obligations. He paid a tax on his mill, on his sheep, and on his cows. He paid a church levy, probably a special assessment, and he paid a fine for keeping a suspected heretic in his home. It looks like he also paid debts and rents to his lord. All told, he owed 40 shillings, 8 pence. The value of money fluctuates over time, but a good rule of thumb is that 13 pence equaled 1 mark, which was equivalent to 1 pound in the 14th century. So 40 shillings is equal to 20 pounds. And if we convert that to US dollars, we get around $250. So while Robert might not have had to come up with nearly $6,000 in taxes, his situation wasn't exactly enviable either. Now here's where things get super interesting. Scholars have calculated that the average laborer earned about 30 shillings a year, which means that Robert was paying nearly his entire annual salary in taxes. Sadly, this was hardly an outlier. Peasants across Europe faced similar burdens. No matter where you lived, the odds of being crushed by taxes, rent, and fees were high. Okay, now let's wrap this up. How does this relate to our original question? Well, if you fall behind on your payments, you might be forced to leave your home and become a migrant worker, or you might be thrown in jail. If you had enough money, you could hire people to work your fields for you. However, hiring workers was risky because you couldn't be sure they'd do a good job, or they might steal from you. So sometimes it was easier to keep working yourself. Even though life was miserable, running away wasn't an option. You were tied to your land and your labor was required to pay off your debts. You might have hoped that you'd be able to work your way out of poverty someday, but for most peasants, that never happened. So there you have it, a quick survey of medieval peasant life. I hope you enjoyed this experiment with a new format. I thought it was a great opportunity to practice my interpretation skills. And I have to thank my editor, Jennifer, for helping me hone my craft. Thank you all for watching and subscribing. I'll see you next time. Winter is here, which means it's officially time for cozy nights by the fire, warm drinks, and endless board games with the family. And while you may not have a roaring fire, we can bring some warmth to your home with our new range of heating solutions. The medieval world was a dark and dangerous place to live. And no matter who you were, whether peasant, lord, or lady, no one was safe during the winter months. In fact, winter could be just as deadly for a king as it was for a pauper. It was certainly just as uncomfortable. Of course, being rich helped,